Yes, friends, we have been talking about electron microscopy, the need for electron microscopy. We said the resolution of any microscope is basically governed by lambda. This is what in the last classes we have seen, where we said resolution can be approximately made equal to lambda by 2. And as a result, if you want to have a good resolution, you need to have a small lambda. And the small lambda in an optical microscope, we have a limitation. We said that the lambda, the lowest that we know is a violet, nothing below violet we know. So and violet if I take it as approximately 200 nanometers as a wavelength, and that divided by 2 will tell me what is the limit of resolution. One point that we have not talked so far, even in the optical microscope, is the connection between resolution and magnification. Everybody thinks, I mean to a large extent, large number of people think the higher the magnification, the better the resolution is. Magnification and resolution have no connection. This is something which all of you have to understand. So what is important is the resolution of optical microscope. For example, if I take the average wavelength of the optical radiation as because optical radiation ranges from 200 to let's say 600 nanometers. So I will take the average as 400 nanometers. If I take the average of 400 nanometers, lambda by 2 is approximately 200 nanometers. This is the resolution of an optical microscope. But my eye, though optical microscope can see any two spots separated by a distance of 200 nanometers, let us say an optical microscope can see it with whatever aberration corrections that we have. But my eye cannot see this. My eye resolution is only 0.1 millimeter. This means equal to 100 microns. A good eye, a healthy eye, can see any two spots separated by a distance of 100 microns only. If two spots are closer than 100 microns, my eye cannot see. A normal eye cannot see this. From a distance of about 1 foot is what is generally defined as the resolution. From a distance of approximately 30 centimeters, if any two spots are kept on this table, let us say separated by a 0.1 millimeter, that means 100 micron, if my eye is a healthy eye, then it can see from a distance of about 1 foot. That is the reason why whenever we go to a doctor, he will give you a and ask you to keep it at a distance of 1 foot and read when you go for your eye checkup. He will not keep it on very far off and ask you to see. Right? So as a result, we usually know that if this is my resolution and if this is my optical microscope resolution, this is the resolution of eye, this is the resolution of an optical microscope, which basically means 0.2 microns. This is 100 microns, this is 0.2 microns. So if I want to be able to see this particular feature, unless this features is magnified in such a way that it comes to this particular distance, my eye cannot see. My eye cannot see this distance. My eye can only see this. Any two spots separated by this distance only my eye can see. If at all there are two spots separated by this distance, if I can magnify this in such a way that the distance between these two increases to this distance, then my eye can see. That means, what is the magnification that I should use? I should use a magnification equivalent to 100 by 0.2, right? 0.2 is the resolution of the optical microscope. 100 microns is the resolution of my eye. Because ultimately, who is seeing it? It's only the human being who is seeing it. If you see an optical microscope, you have a sample, you have an objective lens, you have an eyepiece, and you have an observer who is actually seeing it. So ultimately, everything has to be brought to a level where the observer can see it. The observer's limitation is that he cannot see anything which is closely spaced than 100 microns. Anything which is closer than 100 microns, any observer, however Superman he is, okay, Possibly he cannot see. I have not met a Superman, so I do not know. A normal human being cannot see anything less than 100 microns. So if that is my limitation, then because the optical microscope, because of the light that I am using, it has a limitation in terms of its wavelength, and that wavelength gives me a resolution of this value. So all the lenses that we are using inside the microscope, the objective and the eyepiece, they both should magnify the features in such a way that they bring it to the level of this, which is the resolution of my eye. What is this value? 100 divided by 500. That is the magnification that I need. If I use any magnification higher than that, we call that as an empty magnification, because I am unnecessarily magnifying. I am not getting any additional benefit out of this, excepting that the features are becoming bigger, but the resolution is not changing. Feature becoming bigger is different from resolution. Please remember, resolution means any two closely spaced spots or features which can be separately seen is what is the resolution. What is the smallest distance between any two features which I can see them separately without getting blurred into one single image is what is called the resolution. So this limits the thing. Of course, you say, sir, optical microscope, we are going to 1000 magnification. Why are we going to 1000 magnification? It could be because my actual resolution of my microscope is not 0.2, but less than that. Okay, that for example, I am not able to get 0.2, but I am able to get let's say 0.1 only, 0.1, then it becomes 1000. Or it could be that my eye is bad enough that it is not able to see 100 microns, but can only see if they are separated by 200 microns. My eye is already bad, and many of our have already become bad, so I am not able to see. And that's the reason why we have to go to higher. Otherwise, there is no need. If my eye is in a perfect condition, if the optical microscope is in a perfect condition, then the magnification that we need is only 500 magnification. Anything bigger than that is what we usually term it as empty magnification, because it is not serving any additional purpose in terms of the resolution, but it is only magnifying it. So magnification and resolution are two different things one has to always remember. Now let's jump into our objective of going to a higher resolution. We want to go to a higher resolution because we know there are so many small features that we are interested in. I want to see precipitates inside a precipitation hardened alloy, which are very fine, maybe 20 nanometer, 10 nanometers and things like that. I want to see dislocations inside a material, which may be very small. Obviously, dislocation means it's nothing but a row of vacancies. If it is a row of vacancies, that means the width of a dislocation will not be more than a interatomic distance. So I should be able to see atoms, then only I can see the dislocations. So if you really want to see that, then the only way to be able to see that is to go to a microscope which can show small things. And that's where you need to understand that if you want to see smaller features, the wavelength that I should use should be smaller. Then only I can see small features. As I was explaining in one of the previous classes, if you have two pens here, and I have a wave which is going through these two pens. If I want to see these two pens separately, the wave that I should use should be having a wavelength which is of the order of the distance between these two. If the wave that I use is much bigger, then it will not be able to see these two. It will just pass through these two, and then you will not be able to see them separately. But if I use a smaller wave whose wavelength is smaller than the distance between these two, then I can see it. So if I want to see atoms, my wavelength should be as small as the distance between the atoms. Then only I can see the atoms. So if I want to know the crystal structure of any particular metal, FCC, BCC or so, I should use a wavelength whose wavelength is of the order of the distance between atoms. What are those waves whose wavelength is of the order of the distance between atoms? One is X-rays. That is why X-ray diffraction will tell you about crystal structure. I cannot use a light to find out the crystal structure of atom, crystal structure of a metal. I cannot use it. So I need to use X-rays. The other such radiations are what are called electron beams. I can use electrons to be able to find out. And that electrons is what we have been talking in the last class. We said the wavelength of the electrons is related to the voltage that I use in an electron microscope, and it is given by a formula 1.5 by V. And the higher the voltage that I use, the higher the smaller the wavelength that I get. And usually for a 100 kV electron microscope, we have electron microscopes which usually the smallest that we regularly use is about 100 kV. Of course, there are also biological scientists who want to look at biological species. They don't use microscope with such a high voltage. They use lower, because the higher the voltage, when an electron beam is falling on my sample with a very high voltage, it is also falling with a lot of energy, because the energy of an electron beam is given as EV, and this EV is given by a formula h nu, right? Energy equal to h nu, that is equal to hc by lambda. And so as a result, lambda and V are inversely proportional. I can say lambda equal to hc by EV. Okay, and that is how this formula comes. So if I have a beam with a lot of energy falling on my biological species, most of the biological species may die, may get damaged because of the beam energy itself. So if I want to see live cells, so the live cells may be killed because of the beam energy. So as a result, you want to use lower energy beams to be able to see. And at the same time, one plus point and one lucky thing for all of us is biological species are not really very, very fine. For example, if I want to see white blood cells, you can even see them in an optical microscope, because blood cells have a range of 1 to 10 microns. So you don't need even a TEM. And if you want to see cellulose and things like that in a leaf or something like that, or what is there between the blood cells, if you want to see some information of that, which may be less than a micron or so, you use a lower energy electron beams to be able to see. In fact, people have gone to very high voltages earlier. For example, a 100 kV microscope, as I told you, can give you 0.037 angstroms. But unfortunately, though it is having a wavelength of 0.037, the resolution of a 100 kV microscope is of the order of only 10 angstroms. You may say, sir, it is supposed to be lambda by 2 resolution. Just now you said, so lambda by 2, if I put it here, it should be 0.02 angstroms. But you are saying 10 angstroms. Why is this problem? The problem is because you will see slowly that in an electron microscope, we use certain lenses. Like in an optical microscope, you have an objective lens and a eyepiece. Both of them are lenses which are used to converge the optical light onto the sample. You have to focus the light onto the sample to be able to see the sample. Similarly, if I have an electrons, if I can focus the electrons onto a sample, and then I will be able to see the electrons. To focus the electrons, we use certain lenses called magnetic lenses. And these magnetic lenses have their own aberrations. Every lens has an aberration. Usually we know in an optical lenses, chromatic aberration, spherical aberration. Have you heard of them in optics somewhere? You also have what is called astigmatism, things like that. So variety of aberrations you can have. And if I can correct these aberrations, you will be able to get a very good magnification, a very good resolution. Instead, the other possibility is increase the voltage further. Instead of 100 kV, I have actually seen in Japan a microscope which is 3 million volt microscope. 3000 kV, as high as 3000 kV. In fact, that particular microscope, people used to call it as an overnight express. The reason is this university called Osaka University in Japan, which has this microscope, is the only university in the whole world which has such a microscope of 3000 kV microscope. And there is a railway track near that university. Whenever a train goes, the image is disturbed. So as a result, people used to wait when the trains are not moving, and usually that is in the nights. So they used to use this microscope only in the nights. In fact, you will see that when you are using such high resolution microscopes, where the resolutions you can be able to achieve as low as, let's say, 2 angstroms or so. Such microscopes, people are 1 angstrom or so. 2 angstroms is what people were able to achieve in that microscope. With that kind of microscopes, even if you breathe while taking an image, the image can shake. Okay. So people actually, when they use that microscope, the person who operates the microscope does not sit in front of the microscope. He loads the sample, sits in another room, remotely controls the microscope and records all the images. I have worked on electron microscope for 20 years, so ever since my PhD days. And we remember whenever we used to take an image, after you see the image, whatever microstructure is, when you press the button for recording the image, the camera button, you just take a deep breath and stop for 1 second or so, whatever is the exposure time for that particular image, so that your breath does not influence the actual resolution of the sample. So there are things like that, because we are seeing really images which are at the atomic resolution. Why do I say atomic resolution? Because I know the distances between atoms are usually of the order of 1 to 2 angstroms, right? So I want to actually see atoms. If I want to see atoms, I should be able to have a very stable microscope without any vibrations, and a microscope which has a very high resolution in terms of a very low lambda. Nowadays, people found that there is no point in going for this kind of microscopes. The problem with that kind of microscope is, when I use an electron beam with such a high energy, this energy is so high that it can even destroy my sample. People have seen a crystal structure. If I am starting with an aluminum sample, when I put this beam on that aluminum sample for some time, after some time if I look at the sample, I will see this aluminum is no longer FCC, but it has actually become amorphous. What do you mean by amorphous? No crystal structure. That means the crystal structure has broken down by the bombarded electrons, that they have broken the crystal structure. They destroyed the crystal structure. It has made it into an amorphous structure. There are also possibilities, for example, in some cases where people have taken age hardening. Have you all heard of it? Okay, so if I am doing an age hardening, I have taken an aluminum copper alloy, 4% copper or so, heated to high temperature, quenched it. What do I call this sample now as? Supersaturated solid solution, right? Solutionized sample. This supersaturated solid solution, if I put it into a microscope, what should I see in the microstructure? Microstructure. Do you see precipitates in a supersaturated solid solution? What should you see? What should you see? If I put it in an optical microscope, a sample which is heated to 500 degrees, aluminum copper alloy, quenched it from there, taken that sample, put it into an optical microscope or any microscope, and I am saying that it is a supersaturated solid solution. What should I see in the microscope? I have not gone to a resolution of atoms to see atoms. Simply saying microstructure. What do I see in the microstructure? Yes? Grains. Grains of what? Grains of alpha. Whatever that particular phase is. For example, in an aluminum copper alloy, if you remember this phase diagram, this is aluminum copper phase diagram on the aluminum rich side, which is called theta here, and I am talking of an alloy 4% copper. Are you familiar with this diagram? Yes. So we are heating to this, quenching it to this temperature. If I have not quenched it, I am supposed to have alpha plus theta, right, at room temperature, because this is what is the phase field. If I have heated this and quenched it here, I am supposed to retain this alpha, which is a single phase there. So I will have a single phase alpha. That means I will have simply grains of alpha, and all the 4% copper is dissolved into that alpha. It is a solid solution of 4% copper in an aluminum. Simply a solid solution. Grains of that solid solution is what I will see. Right? What is the microstructure that I have seen? But if I use such a microscope, and I will see after some time, actually, I will not see any more solid solution. I will start seeing the precipitates of theta inside the grains of alpha. Why? Because this particular beam has started heating up my sample, because the energy of the beam is so high that it has started heating my sample. And when I heat a supersaturated solid solution, what I do? I am actually aging it, right? So this is a problem. And if I take an aged sample, peak aged sample, I may see that after some time this sample actually the precipitates might grow, because you must have heard of what is called overaging. Okay, so if I hold a peak aged sample for a long time or heat the peak aged sample to a higher temperature, the precipitates will grow to bigger sizes. And if the temperature is high enough, for example, if I have a sample which is precipitation hardened, after quenching, this precipitation hardened sample is supposed to have precipitates inside my grain, right? These are the precipitates, let's say. If I am heating it by my electron beam itself, that's why, then what happens is the temperature may go here, and if it goes here, let's say, for a hypothetical case, then what happens? All the precipitates dissolve back into the matrix. So you again get a single phase alpha only, and there are no precipitates. These are all what are called artifacts caused by the electron beam itself. This is what is a philosophical question. A lot of people say that the observer himself disturbs the observed. For example, if I want to see an electron using an electron beam, you will not be able to see an electron by electron beam, because by the time your electron beam hits that electron is no more there, right? So these are issues when you want to really see something. The thing which you are using to see it can disturb what you are actually seeing it. So what you are actually seeing it may not be what it really is, but what you are seeing it is what has happened after an interaction of the tool that you are using to see it. Okay, whatever is the product of that interaction is what you are actually seeing. These are very interesting things. As you actually go deeper into material science, you will start understanding this. So what people now started doing is, let me not use very high voltage. High voltage is a problem. First of all, creating such a high voltage itself is a problem, because the normal voltage that we all use is about 220 volts only. We are talking of from 220 volt to 3000 kilovolts, imagine. So you need to have a step-up transformer which can increase the voltage from to that level to be able to use that. It's a very enormous, in fact, such microscope is a region where if you take any of your digital watches, the watches do not work there, because the magnetic field around that microscope is enormous because of that voltage, that the energy of the beam, that anything that you have, any magnetic sample, if you use a steel there, the steel immediately get attracted and touches, like I have seen a movie, what is this fellow, Robo. Okay, so something like that. So this is the kind of the magnetic field that you see there. So what people say is, let me reduce the voltage. So people nowadays are going to microscopes with just about 200 kV, 300 kV. But 200 kV and 300 kV will not give you resolutions which are very high. Then how do I increase the resolution? Then people say the one way to increase the resolution is, can I correct the aberrations? Can I reduce the aberrations? Is there any way that I can reduce the chromatic and the spherical aberration which the lenses which are used to converge the electron beam are creating? And so we have what are called aberration corrected microscopes now. Aberration correct. In an optical microscope, aberration corrections are very easy. For example, spherical aberration, which comes because of the curvature of the lenses. People are trying to use flat lenses now. So that is taken care. There is no spherical aberration if you are using a flat lens. And if you are using a single monochromatic radiation, then you have chromatic aberration also is taken care. Because chromatic aberration comes because you are using a beam having various wavelengths. Right? That is what is chromatic aberration. If you are using a wave with the different wavelengths, through the lens when they are passing through, they get refracted to various positions. As a result, one spot gets focused onto a range of distance. As a result, a spot looks like a disc for us. A spherical spot may look like an elliptical spot for you. That is what is an aberration. It could happen because of chromatic aberration. It could happen also because of spherical aberration. And these two can be corrected. Now we have electron microscopes available for such a thing. And though they are very expensive, pretty expensive, a spherical aberration corrected electron microscope would cost about 15 crores. But people are buying it at IIT Madras. We have recently bought one, and one can get a resolution of the order of 1 angstrom there. And they are the best resolution that people have obtained, where they have corrected both spherical and chromatic aberration, is what is this value. This is what they call it as the best microscope available in the world so far. And in this country, there is only one place where we have this microscope. It is in Bangalore, called Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Materials Research. So this is a place where you have this, and which can give you a resolution of that order. So let's go and look at these microscopes, and what are the principles of seeing such fine things. I was telling you in the previous class that in order to see use an electron microscope, first and foremost is we generate electrons using two techniques. One is what is called thermionic emission, and second is called field emission. So we generate electrons through one of these techniques, where we use a filament and either heat the filament or apply a very high voltage potential difference between the filament and a small annular aperture, and that can generate electrons. And these electrons are made to travel towards the sample by, first of all, removing all the gas molecules in this domain, so that the gas molecules do not scatter away the electrons. Because otherwise, if you have electrons here, all the gas molecules will scatter it away. So you create a high vacuum, 10 to the power minus 6 to 10 to the power minus 8 torr, which is millimeters of mercury. And after their vacuum is created, now you allow the electron beam to travel towards this sample by applying a potential difference between these two, and make this as positive. You will have a photosensitive screen at the bottom, and this photosensitive screen is made as positive, and electrons have a tendency to move towards the positive, and apply a voltage difference depending on what kind of a microscope you are using, either 100 kV, 200 kV, 300 kV, or whatever it is. So there are different microscopes available with different capabilities, and generally ranging from 100 kV to 300 kV. And when you apply such a voltage difference, the electrons will start moving. And for the electrons to be able to converge onto the sample, we use certain lenses, which are called magnetic lenses, which will converge, and the magnetic lenses will be something like, they look like this, annular lenses, because this whole thing is a cylinder. So the magnetic lens is a circular magnetic lens, which is around the beam, the optical path of the beam. So, and the beam will, once you converge, the beam will go through this. And you have an objective somewhere here, through which the beam goes through and then falls onto the sample. And here is the difference comes in terms of two types of microscopes. One is scanning electron microscope, another is a transmission electron microscope. Everything else is same in terms of electrons generation is concerned. Either you have electrons generated by thermionic emission, by heating a filament, or by applying a potential, you generate these electrons. Once the electrons are generated, when they are allowed to fall by the magnetic lenses, after they are falling, whether they are going through the sample and you are seeing the image at the below the sample by a beam which is being transmitted through the sample, or whether the beam is being reflected from the surface of the sample, is what decides whether you are talking about an SEM or a TEM. SEM is a scanning electron microscope, where the electron beam is allowed to reflect from a surface, and that reflected beam is what you are seeing. Or in a transmission electron microscope, the beam is allowed to pass through the sample and then made to see. And this beam which is passing through the sample falls onto a photosensitive screen, and the image of this you will see. When you say image of the thing you see, we should know also what is the mechanism by which I will see this image. We will try to see that. We will also try to see that in order for the electron beam to pass through this sample, the sample has to be very, very thin. Why it has to be thin? Because this sample, if it is my aluminum copper alloy, let us say, aluminum copper alloy has free electrons in it, right? Any metallic sample has free electrons. And these free electrons, when an electron beam is going through it, these free electrons present inside the sample will scatter away the electron beam which is going through the sample. And as a result, when the electron beam is coming out of it, the intensity of the electron beam is significantly lowered because of the electrons which are present in the sample. So as a result, unless my sample thickness is very small, so that the total volume of the sample through which the beam is going through is very small, so that the probability of this electron beam being scattered away by the electrons present in the sample is very, very small. For this, you need to have special techniques by which you prepare the sample. Let's spend a few minutes on this sample preparation techniques before we actually jump into the actual microscopy. And for this, we need to have a sample as thin as 100 nanometers. We use for electron microscopy, TEM, transmission electron microscopy, samples as thin as 100 nanometers, 0.1 micron. How do I prepare such a sample is a question. And there also, this whether it is 100 microns or 100 nanometers or 200 nanometers or 50 nanometers depends on what kind of a metal that I am looking at. For example, if I have to see either aluminum sample or an iron sample or a tungsten sample, the thickness that I can allow for the sample to be observed by the electron beam is going to be different. Why? Because as you can see, what is the difference between all three of them? Anybody who can tell me? Anything more? Yes. Anything more? Yes. Number of electrons. Atomic number is different. Right? The atomic number of three of them is different. Of course, the all others what you have said is also correct. But in this particular context, all of them do not matter for us. It is only the number of electrons matter. So as I go from this to this to this, the number of electrons are increasing. As the number of electrons are increasing in the same thickness of the sample, I will have more number of electrons in tungsten when compared to aluminum. So that means the more chance for the electron beam to get scattered by the electrons of the sample. So that means if I use the same thickness of aluminum and same thickness of tungsten, I will see that the beam that is coming out of the tungsten will have much less intensity when compared to the beam that is coming out of the aluminum. Right? So as a result, if I am using a very low atomic number samples, I can afford to have a thicker sample without losing the intensity of the beam. But if I am using a more atomic number sample, if I am trying to look at the tungsten based alloys for some application, I need to use very thin sample there so that I don't lose. What happens if I lose the beam? You will see that when I see the image here, the image looks completely black, dark, no contrast will be seen. So as a result, the beam that is coming out does not have any intensity at all. And as a result, you see everything as very dark. The easiest way to know that your sample is very thick is to see the image, and if the image looks completely black, usually we tell the student, go back, prepare your sample once again and come back. Like if you are preparing an optical microscopy sample, your professor will see, put it in a microscope and see if there are so many scratches, he'll say, okay, you are not prepared a sample well, go back and again bring it back without scratches, right? Have you prepared your samples anytime? Polished it? And you know how difficult it is? So if you think preparing an optical microscopy sample itself is difficult, preparing an electron microscopy sample is not so easy. And it needs a lot of patience. And of course, we always say that if you want to gain something, you need to have patience. Okay? In life, if you want to really achieve something, you need to have patience and you need to have perseverance. And similarly here, if you have perseverance, you will see wonderful samples. You will also see, as I will show you possibly a little later, various microstructures and even nanoparticles. You can even see atoms, and this is really fascinating to see them. So to do that, what do we do? So as I can tell you that the smaller the atomic number, the thicker the sample I can have. But usually any sample, even if I am using a sample like aluminum, if I go beyond 200 nanometers thickness, I will not be able to see anything. So that's kind of an ultimate limit, approximately around 200 nanometers. But if I am using a sample like boron or something like that, very, very low atomic numbers, possibly I can accommodate slightly thicker samples. So, but rarely we come across commercial alloys. Most of the commercial alloys that we have is either aluminum alloys, copper alloys, iron alloys, nickel based alloys, things like that. So for any of these alloys, as you see, the lowest atomic number is only aluminum. All other commercial alloys that we are aware of are all having higher atomic numbers. Okay, so this is our goal. How do I achieve this? To do that, what I have to do is, for example, if there are two ways of doing it. One is, if your sample is by any chance, let's say you are working on nanomaterials, that you have made some nanoparticles. What are nanoparticles? Yes. When do you call a particle as a nanoparticle? When the diameter, wait. When the diameter is, yes, 10 to the minus 9 meter is 1 nanometer, right? So when the diameter becomes 1 nanometer, will you call it as a nanoparticle? Anybody else who has heard a little more? Even in newspapers nowadays, you have articles about nano. It is not exactly so. Usually, when the diameter of the particle is generally around less than 100 nanometers, we call it as a nanomaterial. Of course, this is not a very sacrosanct number. Actually, the definition of when to call something as a nano. For example, I can express my height in nanometers, right? Will I become a nano fellow? No. So just by expressing anything in nanometers does not make anything into nano. You have to bring down the size to a certain size. When the properties suddenly start changing significantly, then we start calling them as nano. And the property changing depends on which property you are looking at. If I am simply talking about mechanical properties, usually around less than 100 nanometers, the strength of most of the metals is significantly higher than normal metals. So we can use this term. But if I am looking at magnetic property or electrical properties, for example, there are certain numbers, certain particle sizes. If you go below a certain particle size, a pure iron, which is ferromagnetic, can even become paramagnetic. When does a ferromagnetic material become paramagnetic? When I heat it above Tc, right? Now let's say I have an iron which has a certain Tc. What is the Tc of iron? Anybody knows? 768, right? Pure iron has a 768. Let's say if I have a iron and which is pure iron and at room temperature and it still shows paramagnetic behavior. That means that I have not heated it above Tc, but it is as if I have heated it. By reducing the particle size, you will see that this Tc keeps on coming down, and below a certain particle size, this Tc suddenly comes below the room temperature. It is like your MS temperature. You keep on adding alloying elements, MS temperature keeps on going down. As a result, you see some alloys, even if I quench it to room temperature, I am not able to get martensite. I still have only austenite. That is because martensite starting temperature has gone below the room temperature, and I need to do something called cryo treatment. Take it below the room temperature to be able to make it martensite. Similarly, if I have, for example, even without making anything nano, we can do this. How do you make iron into non-magnetic without heating? Heating. Okay, that's one way. That means you are straining it. Okay, I don't do that. Is there any way to do it by adding alloying elements? If you know austenitic stainless steel, for example, austenitic stainless steel, is it magnetic? Non-magnetic. In fact, if you have ever gone along with your mother to buy a stainless steel plate, she will carry a magnet or something like that to check whether it is really austenitic stainless steel or not. Otherwise, somebody is cheating her by giving a ferritic steel. So that's because it is austenitic stainless steel is magnetic, non-magnetic. The reason is austenite is supposed to exist at higher temperature, which is supposed to be gamma iron, which is the paramagnetic form of iron. And if I can bring that paramagnetic form of iron to room temperature, then that means I have been able to bring make an iron into non-magnetic at room temperature. How do I do that? By adding certain alloying elements. For example, nickel, if I add it, okay, you can see nickel chromium. If they are added, then significantly the TC comes down. So one can do this, and this is by alloying. Without even alloying, if by just simply decreasing the particle size, there is a possibility of converting the ferromagnetic materials to paramagnetic materials. All this is possible by simply making it nano. If I have such a nanoparticle, I want to see it using an electron microscope. What I can do is I simply disperse the particles. For example, I have a microscope in which I have to hold the sample here in the path of the electron beam. How do I hold nanoparticles in the path of the electron beam? I cannot just allow them to float. So for that I need to have a kind of a substrate on which I can have these nanoparticles. For that what we use is, we use what is called carbon coated copper grid, we call it. What we do is we take a grid of copper, a mesh. Have you seen meshes? Have you ever seen sieves? Okay, so a sieve of copper. Okay, you must have seen at your home plastic sieves, iron sieves. Your mother might be using it for some rava or whatever it is. Okay, so similar sieve with a very fine mesh. There are different meshes available, 200 mesh, 400 mesh and things like that. So if I take such a mesh and coat carbon on it, amorphous carbon. Carbon can exist in various forms. Possibly you are all aware of. What are all the forms that you are aware of? Diamond, wait, I'll ask her. Please tell me. Diamond, graphite, anything else that you know of carbon? I just know said amorphous. Anything more? Yes? Fullerenes, very good. Fullerenes, and then nanotubes, and then graphene. So that's the whole story of it. Sit down. So these are all various forms of carbon. People have been using them very regularly. So now if I have an amorphous carbon, I will tell you a little later why we didn't have amorphous carbon, because if I am putting my nanoparticles on this, what I do is I take the nanoparticles, disperse it into a medium such as an acetone or something like that, and take once it is dispersed, take a drop of this acetone containing these nanoparticles and put this drop on this carbon coated copper grid. The acetone immediately evaporates and you have carbon, the nanoparticles dispersed on this thin sheet of carbon. And now if I put this into this TEM and then allow the electron beam to go through, I will be able to see these fine particles. I will be able to see what are the particle sizes of them. I will be also able to see what is the shape of these nanoparticles and the size distribution of these nanoparticles. I can even find out by using what is called an electron diffraction, the crystal structure of those nanoparticles also. Because like we have X-ray diffraction, the same principle can be applied even for electron diffraction. What we see is that if you have a beam falling on a sample with a wavelength which is of the order of the atomic sizes or less than the atomic sizes, interatomic sizes, then you can have a diffraction taking place, right? And the Bragg's law that we talk about, lambda equal to 2d sine theta, can also be used whether it is X-ray diffraction or an electron diffraction. We will try to see as we go along what are the differences between these two, but you can get the diffraction. But at that point of time you will know the advantage of using an amorphous carbon, because if this carbon is a graphite carbon, graphite has certain crystal structure. What is the crystal structure of graphite? Hexagonal? HCP. HCP, are you sure? How many of you want to support him? Is graphite HCP? Only hexagonal. Who said this? Yes. Why do you think so? If you know the property of graphite, you will know that. Graphite is very soft. Okay? Shears. We use it even as a lubricant. We use it in pencils. Why is that we use it? Because it is just hexagonal. Okay? If it was HCP, what is the difference between HCP and hexagonal? Can you tell me? Number 3 from the left. What's your name? Jyotsna. Tell me, Jyotsna. Do you know the difference between the two? No? Anybody who knows the difference between the two? Hold on. Anybody else? Yes. Pavitra. Right? Yes, Pavitra, tell me. Yes. Correct. Between the two basal planes at the middle of the C-axis, you have another layer with these 3 atoms. Okay? And that's what we call it as a B layer. AB, AB, AB stacking we say. Whereas in a hexagonal, you don't have that middle layer. There is no B layer at all. It is A. And because of that, between the 2 A layers, there is a weak bond. Van der Waals kind of a bond. And that's why they can be sheared. Whereas if it is hexagonal close packed, it would not have been possible for it to shear because there is an atom at the atomic layer at the middle. It would not have been possible. So that's the reason why most of the metals such that we know, for example, titanium, magnesium, these are all HCP. Whereas graphite is hexagonal, not HCP. And that's the reason why people are able to peel off these layers, each layer, and then calling it as graphene. And taking one of the layer, rolling it, and making a tube out of it, and calling it as carbon nanotubes. This is such a fascinating thing people can do because of the fascinating structures that they have. So, if I have an amorphous structure and I have nanoparticles, when I'm putting my electron beam to find out if I have the nanoparticles deposited on this, if I want to find out the crystal structure of any one of the particle, I put my electron beam which is falling like this on this particular grid which is kept here, and the diffraction pattern which I observe at the bottom, because once the beam falls onto the sample, let's say there is a nanoparticle here, the beam is going through, and if it is also getting diffracted, there is also a diffracted beams that are coming out. I also have one transmitted beam going through, I also have a diffracted beams coming out. If I collect all these diffracted beams onto a screen, which is here, what is called a photosensitive screen, whenever a beam hits a screen, what do you see? You see a spot. So you will have a kind of a rangoli there. If you ever use rangoli, spots, spotty, spotty, spotty. And if you can observe how these spots are arranged, from the arrangement of these spots, I can understand what is the crystal structure. But if this particular sheet, why do I need that sheet? If I don't have the sheet, nanoparticles will fall off in the mesh, right? I need that sheet to hold these nanoparticles. And if that sheet is a graphite sheet or some other sheet, obviously the crystal structure of that will interfere with the crystal structure of my sample. That's why I use an amorphous carbon. And that amorphous carbon also should be very, very thin, so that the electron beam does not get scattered away by the carbon, by the electrons present in that graphite, in that amorphous carbon. Of course, luckily carbon has very low atomic number. The scattering will be low because number of electrons are low. But even there also, unless the sample is sheet is very thin, so we use of the order of around 10 angstroms kind of thin sheets are deposited, and that's such a deposited carbon film is on to which you put these nanoparticles. So this is very easy if you are studying nanoparticles. But most of our research is not just on nanoparticles. I want to look at aluminum copper alloy. I want to put a steel into the microscope and look at whether there are some carbides in my steel or some cementite, and how is the distribution of cementite. If I am adding some what are called microalloying elements, have you ever heard of microalloying elements added to steel? Niobium, vanadium and things like that, and you form some carbides, niobium carbide, vanadium carbide, and these are all very fine particles. I want to see all of them. And this steel is, it can be either in the rod form or it can be in the sheet form, rolled sheet, okay, or and rolled rods. How do I see that such kind of a sample? For that, we need a number of steps of preparation. First thing that we do is you take a rod like this and slice off a thin section by some kind of abrasive cutting. We have special machines that are available where you can get as thin as about 100 micron thin sample, which are called diamond cutters. So we can use such a diamond cutter, slow speed saw it is called, and using such slow speed saw, of course it takes quite a long time to cut sample like that, but you can get very accurately very thin sample. The reason why we need to get such a thin sample, I will tell you a little later. If you do not get such a thin sample, and you will get into certain problems, we will talk about it a little later. So once I have such a thin sample, I am still not reached 100 nanometers. My goal is to reach there. And by cutting, I cannot make very small samples. So how do we bring from here to here is what we will see in the next class. We will stop for a while right now.